On a blistering morning in 490 BC, two forces stood facing each other on the plains of Marathon, and by every rational measure, this battle should have been over before it even began. On one side stood the Persian Empire, the most powerful military machine the world had ever seen. Its armies had crushed kingdoms from Egypt to India, its numbers so vast that ancient writers claimed their arrows could blot out the sun. This wasn't just an army, it was an empire in motion, confident, unstoppable, and used to winning. Facing them was something far smaller. Barely 10,000 Greek soldiers, citizens, not professionals, farmers, craftsmen, and merchants who had taken up shields and spears to defend their homeland. They had no cavalry, no overwhelming numbers, and no margin for error. By all expectations, they were about to be erased. But what made this moment truly extraordinary wasn't just the imbalance of power. It was what was at stake. If these Greeks fell, the road to Athens would lie open, and with it, the fragile experiment of democracy could be extinguished before it ever had the chance to shape the world. Everything that would later define Western civilization, its politics, philosophy, and ideals, hung in the balance on that narrow stretch of land. And yet, against every prediction, something happened on that battlefield that no one, not the Persians, not even the Greeks themselves, could have fully imagined. The question is not just how they fought, but how they won. Long before the clash at Marathon, the story begins in the heart of an empire that had never learned how to lose. Under the rule of Darius I, the Persian Empire had become the largest and most formidable power the world had ever seen. Stretching across 3 continents, from the deserts of Egypt to the mountains of India, it was a machine built on precision, discipline, and absolute authority. Its roads connected distant lands, its armies moved with terrifying efficiency, and its king ruled not just through force, but through the unshakable belief that resistance was futile. To Darius, the scattered Greek city-states on the western edge of his empire were little more than a nuisance, fractured, argumentative, and insignificant. But that perception changed the moment they dared to interfere. Along the coast of what is now modern-day Turkey, Greek cities known as Ionia had fallen under Persian control. For years, they lived under the authority of the empire, paying tribute and obeying Persian rule. But in 499 BC, something unexpected happened. These cities rose in rebellion. It wasn't supposed to matter. Small uprisings like this had been crushed countless times before. But this one was different, not because of its size, but because of who chose to get involved. Athens, along with a few allies, made a decision that would change everything. They sent ships and soldiers across the Aegean Sea to support the rebellion. It was a bold move, almost reckless by any standard. They weren't just helping distant cousins, they were openly challenging the authority of the most powerful empire on earth. The revolt ultimately failed. Persian forces crushed the uprising, burning cities and reasserting control. But for Darius, the damage had already been done. This wasn't just rebellion anymore, it was insult. A direct challenge to his power, his authority, and his reputation as the King of Kings. And in an empire built on dominance, reputation was everything. From that moment on, Darius became obsessed with Greece. Not because it was a major threat, but because it had dared to defy him. He didn't just want victory, he wanted a message. A warning to the world about what happens when you stand against the Persian Empire. So he began to prepare. In 491 BC, Persian envoys traveled across the Greek world carrying a simple demand: earth and water. It was a symbolic gesture, a quiet way of saying, submit to Persian rule and live. Many cities complied. Faced with the overwhelming power of Persia, surrender seemed like the only rational choice. But Athens and Sparta weren't interested in being rational. In acts that shocked the ancient world, both cities rejected the demand outright. According to tradition, the Athenians threw the envoys into a pit, while the Spartans cast them into a well, telling them to dig out their own earth and water. It was more than defiance, it was a declaration. They weren't just refusing submission, they were inviting war. At that point, there was no turning back. Diplomacy was over. The conflict had become inevitable. Darius responded the only way an emperor could. He began assembling a force designed not just to conquer, but to make an example. This would not be a simple raid, it would be a calculated campaign. First, secure control of the Aegean by subduing the islands. Then strike key targets that had supported the rebellion. And finally, march on Athens itself, crush its rising democracy, and replace it with a ruler loyal to Persia. This wasn't just strategy, it was psychological warfare. The Persian invasion force reflected the scale of that ambition. It wasn't a single army, but a coalition drawn from across the empire, archers from Persia, cavalry from the steppes, marines from Phoenicia. Each unit brought its own strengths, forming a diverse and highly adaptable military machine. Backed by a powerful fleet, they could strike quickly, control the coastline, and choose exactly where to land. Their plan was elegant in its simplicity and terrifying in its execution. As the fleet moved westward across the Aegean, island after island submitted without resistance. The sheer size of the Persian force made fighting seem pointless. Then came the city of Eretria. It resisted briefly. But after days of siege, betrayal opened its gates. The Persians sacked the city, enslaved its people, and burned it to the ground. It was a message written in fire. This is what happens when you resist. And Athens was next. By the time Persian ships approached the shores of Marathon, the outcome seemed almost predetermined. A global superpower had set its sights on a small, divided land. The motivation was clear. The stakes were rising, and the stage was set for a confrontation that, by all logic, should have ended in total annihilation. But history, as it turns out, doesn't always follow logic. When the Persian fleet finally appeared off the coast of Marathon, it didn't arrive quietly. Hundreds of ships cut across the Aegean, carrying an army that had already reduced cities to ash. As they made landfall on the wide, open plain, everything about the location signaled confidence. Marathon offered exactly what the Persians needed: room for their cavalry to maneuver, a secure bay for their fleet, and a direct route toward Athens. It wasn't just a landing. It was a statement. Word reached Athens fast, and the reaction was immediate. Panic spread through the city like wildfire. Just days earlier, news had arrived that Eretria had been destroyed, its people enslaved, its temples burned. Now the same army stood less than a day's march away. In the crowded marketplace, citizens whispered about surrender, exile, or escape into the mountains. The reality was hard to ignore. Athens was not built to withstand a siege by the most powerful empire on earth. But in moments like this, leadership defines everything. And that's when Miltiades stepped forward. Miltiades wasn't just another general. He had seen the Persian war machine up close, having once served under their command. He understood how they fought, how they thought, and more importantly, where they could be vulnerable. While others saw inevitability, he saw opportunity. Standing before the Athenian assembly, he made a case that must have sounded almost insane. Athens should not wait. It should not hide behind its walls. It should march out and meet the Persians in open battle. The city's leadership was divided. Among the 10 generals responsible for the army, opinions clashed sharply. Some argued for caution, delay the fight, wait for reinforcements from Sparta, buy time. Others leaned toward negotiation, hoping to avoid total destruction. The safer path was clear. But Miltiades pushed for something far riskier: immediate action. The debate stretched on, heavy with the weight of what was at stake. This wasn't just a military decision, it was a choice that would determine whether Athens lived or fell. In the end, the final vote rested with one man, the Polemarch Callimachus. His decision would tip the balance. And when the moment came, he sided with Miltiades. Athens would fight. The shift was immediate. Fear gave way to urgency. Across the city, men began preparing for war, not professional soldiers, but citizens. Farmers left their fields. Craftsmen put down their tools. Fathers, sons, and brothers gathered their armor, many of them inherited from previous generations. These weren't elite troops trained for conquest. They were ordinary people about to face an extraordinary threat. At the same time, Athens knew it couldn't stand alone, not against Persia. A runner was dispatched north to Sparta, the most powerful military force in Greece. His name was Phidippides, and his mission bordered on impossible: cover roughly 150 miles in just a couple of days, and convince the Spartans to send immediate aid. He ran across rugged terrain, through heat and exhaustion, carrying the fate of his city with every step. And when he arrived, he delivered the message. But the response was not what Athens needed. The Spartans didn't refuse, but they couldn't move immediately. Religious law required them to wait until the full moon before marching to war. In other words, help would come, just not in time. Back in Athens, there was no longer any illusion of rescue. Whatever was going to happen at Marathon would happen with the forces they had. And yet, they weren't entirely alone. A small but loyal ally, the city of Plataea, sent around 1,000 soldiers to stand beside them. It wasn't a large reinforcement, but it meant something far greater. It meant Athens wasn't abandoned. As the Greek army marched toward Marathon, the mood shifted again. Fear didn't disappear, but it hardened into something else: resolve. These men understood exactly what they were walking into. They knew the odds. They had heard the stories of Persian dominance. And still, they moved forward. When they reached the battlefield, the contrast was impossible to ignore. The Persian army stretched across the plain in a display of power and scale. Their formations were deep, their numbers overwhelming, their cavalry ready to strike. Across from them, the Greek line was thinner, quieter, almost fragile by comparison. And then, nothing happened. 4 days, both sides waited. It was a tense, silent standoff. Neither army wanted to make the first move. The Persians expected the Greeks to attack recklessly and be crushed by arrows and cavalry. The Greeks hoped to hold their ground just long enough for Spartan reinforcements to arrive, even though they knew, deep down, that help might not come in time. Every hour that passed added pressure. Soldiers checked their weapons over and over again. Commanders studied the terrain, searching for any advantage. The heat, the silence, the anticipation, it all built into something almost unbearable. Because everyone on that field understood the truth. When the first move finally came, there would be no second chances. By the 5th day, the tension had stretched to its breaking point. Both armies had stared each other down long enough to understand one thing. When this fight began, it would be decisive. And that's when Miltiades made the call that would change everything. He had spent days studying the Persian formation, reading not just their numbers, but their structure. Their strongest troops held the center, elite warriors hardened by years of conquest. But their flanks were different. There, the line was filled with subject allies, less disciplined, less invested, and more likely to break under pressure. To most commanders, that imbalance would have been a detail. To Miltiades, it was the entire battle. So he did something no Greek general was supposed to do. He weakened his own center. Instead of building a solid, deep formation designed to smash straight through the enemy, he stretched his line thin in the middle and reinforced both wings. It was a gamble that bordered on reckless. If the center collapsed too quickly, the entire army could be split in two and destroyed. But if the wings held, and if they broke the Persian flanks fast enough, something extraordinary could happen. It was a plan built on timing, discipline, and trust. And once it began, there would be no way to adjust. Then, without warning, the Greeks moved. Not slowly, not cautiously, but at a full run. Across nearly a mile of open ground, thousands of armored soldiers charged directly at the Persian line. It was something the Persians had never seen before. Armies didn't run into battle like this. They advanced in measured steps, preserving order, conserving energy. But the Greeks understood something critical. The longer they stayed at range, the more time Persian archers had to tear them apart. So they ran straight into the storm. Arrows filled the sky, darkening the air as they came down in waves. Shields rattled under the impact. Men fell. But the line didn't break. Step by step, breath by breath, they closed the distance until there was no more space for arrows, only steel. When the two forces collided, it wasn't just a clash. It was an explosion. Bronze slammed into wicker shields. Spears drove forward, splintering on impact, finding flesh through gaps in armor. The noise alone was overwhelming. Metal, shouting, bodies colliding in a chaos that no formation could fully contain. For a moment, it looked exactly as expected, overwhelming Persian numbers pressing against a thinner Greek line. And in the center, that pressure began to show. The Greek middle, intentionally weakened, started to give ground. Step by step, they were pushed backward by the Persian elite. To any outside observer, it looked like the beginning of the end. The line was bending, close to breaking. Persian commanders watching from behind would have seen what they expected: victory unfolding right in front of them. But that was only half the battle. On the wings, everything was different. There, the reinforced Greek flanks hit with brutal force. On both sides, they drove into the weaker Persian units, overwhelming them in close combat. This was where Greek training mattered most: tight formations, heavy armor, disciplined movement. The Persian flanks, less prepared for this kind of brutal, face-to-face fighting, began to buckle. And then they broke. What started as cracks quickly turned into collapse. Soldiers on the Persian edges began to retreat, then to run. And as they did, something critical happened. The center became exposed. At that exact moment, the entire battle turned. The Greek wings, having shattered their opponents, didn't stop. They pivoted inward, closing like a set of jaws around the Persian center. At the same time, the Greek middle, bloodied but unbroken, stopped retreating and reformed. In seconds, the Persians went from advancing to surrounded. What had looked like a winning push suddenly became a trap. Confusion spread fast. Commands were lost in the noise. Units that had been advancing found themselves attacked from the sides, then from behind. The tight formation that had once been their strength now worked against them, compressing their own soldiers into a space where they could barely move. And the Greeks pressed in from all directions. This wasn't a battle anymore. It was a collapse. Persian soldiers who had marched across continents, who had crushed kingdoms and faced countless enemies, now found themselves trapped with no clear escape. The discipline that had carried them this far broke under the pressure. What followed was panic, then flight. They ran for their ships. But even retreat came at a cost. The Greeks pursued relentlessly, cutting down fleeing soldiers, driving them toward the shoreline in chaos. Thousands fell before they ever reached safety. What had begun as an overwhelming invasion ended in a desperate escape. By the time the fighting stopped, the scale of what had happened was almost impossible to process. A smaller force, outnumbered and outmatched on paper, had just dismantled one of the most powerful armies in the world. Not by chance, not by luck, but by design. And in that moment, on that field, the impossible had become reality. When the dust finally settled on the plains of Marathon, the scale of what had just happened began to sink in. What was supposed to be a decisive Persian victory had turned into a stunning defeat. Thousands of Persian soldiers lay scattered across the battlefield, while the surviving forces scrambled back to their ships in chaos. But for the Greeks, there was no time to celebrate. They knew this wasn't over. Without hesitation, the Athenian army, exhausted, wounded, but driven by urgency, marched back to defend their city. Nearly 26 miles in a single push, under the weight of armor and the strain of battle, they returned to Athens before the Persian fleet could arrive. And when those ships finally appeared on the horizon, they found something they didn't expect: the same army, standing ready, unbroken. That was the moment the Persian campaign truly failed. But Marathon was never just about one battle. It was proof, undeniable proof, that even the most powerful empire in the world could be challenged. That free citizens, fighting not for conquest but for their way of life, could overcome overwhelming odds. In the years that followed, this victory would help ignite the rise of Athens. Its democracy, its philosophy, its culture, foundations that would go on to shape much of what we now call Western civilization. At its core, Marathon is more than history. It's a reminder that strategy can outmatch strength, that courage can rewrite outcomes, and that sometimes the underdog doesn't just survive, they change the world. If you found this story powerful, make sure to subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into the moments that shaped history. Because the next story might just change the way you see the world.